part of the Growth Center and the Ray Bakke Program for Biblical Entrepreneurship. I can tell you that it has caused me as a workplace minister, meaning that I am a consultant in a secular context and often think about where and how to integrate my faith. I can assure you for a number of years as an entrepreneur, I was really struggling with trying to figure out how to find the biblical part that went with my faith. I was definitely in the mindset of being a follower of Jesus Christ. And for many years, I had that parallel track as an entrepreneur and a business owner. It wasn't until a very wise counselor and mentor recommended that a big part of my leadership growth and development as a kingdom entrepreneur or as a biblical entrepreneur could be deeply influenced by someone who understood the best of secular best practices, growth, high performance, getting results through the lens of architecture and design around the one perfect human, and that would be Jesus Christ himself. And so, Andy, you have been a person, much like Tony Dungy referred to Tom Landry so many years ago as a mentor from afar. You have been a mentor of mine from afar. As I think about the groundbreaking work that you expressed in your book, Strong and Weak, it has become the cornerstone from which my secular entrepreneurship has shifted into a kingdom focused entrepreneurship, and where the authenticity of knowing how to be incredibly strong with the authority that is Jesus Christ, and with the understanding of the authenticity and the vulnerability of what it means to bring a humanity to the experience. I want you to know I am grateful for your work. I am absolutely applying to be the president of your fan club, and I know that everyone listening this evening is going to be greatly blessed by your perspective around the paradox between authority and vulnerability. So without further ado, Andy, author of Strong and Weak, there's a true flourishing that we have when we travel down that unexpected path, that paradoxical path of strong and weak. And when we see this unlikely mixture in practice, this is really where the best leaders can emerge. So with that, Andy, welcome. Participants, we're going to invite you to ask us questions as we go. There is a Q&A function at the bottom near the chat function. And if you would like to ask questions, please feel free to register those. We will hear Andy's prepared remarks, and then we're going to have a great opportunity to really connect the dots, answering your specific questions and really bringing this message to life. So Andy, bless you. Thank you for being with us. And with that, I'll turn it to you.
Thank you so much, Deb. It is absolutely a pleasure to be with you all and to be with people from so many parts of the world, including those who are up very late or up very early, and especially those of you who are joining us using a language that you didn't necessarily grow up speaking. So grateful that you are all making the effort to be with us. I'm going to share with you some ideas that have become very important to the entrepreneurs that we train at Praxis, where I work with people in both nonprofit and business spheres. Actually, as Deb mentioned in her own practice, most of them not running only Christian organizations. They are all Christians, but they're running organizations in every sector, every kind of model of business and nonprofit. We've worked with about 200 organizations. And every new group that we bring through, we work with 12 at a time. We just met our 12 business nonprofits last week and our 12 nonprofit fellows 3 weeks ago. We give them this material that I'm going to give you now, and consistently it helps frame both the beautiful opportunity before us as entrepreneurs and as followers of Christ, but also the real challenge of living in a world where things aren't always as they're meant to be. So I've shared my screen, and I trust you're able to see it now. If for some reason you can't see it, put some little note in the chat, because I want to talk about two things that may initially sound, or we might imagine that they are quite different from each other or quite distinct from each other: authority and vulnerability. And I'm going to use authority in maybe a slightly broader way than you might think. When you think of authority, you might think of someone with a position or a title of power, the chief executive officer of a company, the executive director of a nonprofit, the senior pastor of a church, people with titles of power. But I'm going to use it more broadly to refer to any time that we have capacity for meaningful action. That is, we can act and it will make a difference in the world that matters to us and matters to the people around us. So you have authority whenever you have the capacity to act, and it's meaningful. It matters. You think it matters. Other people think it matters. And then there's the idea of vulnerability. And I'm also going to use this word in a broader way than we might sometimes use it. Sometimes it is used, especially in the United States in social service contexts, to refer to the specific things that make people in need of social services. We think of vulnerable populations. Sometimes it's used in a very different way, actually, to talk about emotional transparency. So that if I were to start sharing about my daughter, who is now 22 years old, and when she was a child and what it was like to be her father, and I were to get a little emotional and perhaps tears would come to my eyes, you might say, oh, that was very vulnerable. And I'm not saying that there aren't real vulnerabilities in people's lives that social services can help with. And I'm not saying that emotional transparency is not real vulnerability sometimes, but I'm going to use it very broadly. I'm going to use it to refer to any time you are experiencing exposure to meaningful risk. That is, something you care about could be lost. This is, I think, the basic definition of risk, the possibility of loss. And it matters to you. If it were to be lost, that would be meaningful. That would matter to you and maybe to others as well. And you are exposed to this risk, which means you do not know for sure how it's going to turn out. I think it initially sounds like these are very different things. But in fact, I have come to believe they actually go together in a particularly powerful way, which is when you ask people about the peak experiences of what I would call flourishing in their lives, they actually talk about both of these things. When we think about the moments in our lives when we have felt most alive, when we've felt most sure that we were being what we were meant to be, when we experience that kind of abundance of life, the life that really is life that Paul talks about in 2 Timothy, the life abundant that Jesus talks about in John 10, that actually it has these two components together. That is, there is always a component of meaningful action. Not when I ask people about kind of peak experiences, two things come up reasonably often. One is if people are parents, they talk about the birth of their children or raising their children, and of course, there's a huge amount of capacity for meaningful action in the life of parents with their children. But there is also, in a way, children maybe don't appreciate a huge amount of vulnerability as a parent. And it's actually those two together. And of course, childbirth itself, which often women will mention that as a peak experience of their lives, if they have given birth and it was a healthy birth in particular, they'll think that was just the most amazing moment. We know how much risk there is in childbirth for mother and child. And it's these two together. Now, the other thing people talk about a lot, they talk a fair amount about kind of recreational sports. I don't know that I'm often with like pro athletes who, went to the Super Bowl, though I imagine they might talk about it in this context. But even just people who went water skiing or downhill skiing or play really exciting games, you think about the capacity of authority. That is, you have the capacity out on that field to do something that within the game matters and makes a difference. And you maybe have developed some skill at whatever sport you're playing. But there's always risk if it's a high flourishing experience. So people never talk about practicing free throws in American basketball as a high point, but maybe the defining free throw of a game, the winning point, where you've practiced that free throw over and over, so you have the authority, but everything's on the line and you could miss, and so you have the vulnerability. It's actually what makes sports so exciting to watch, I think. Is that we see people at the peak of their capacity to act because they're trained and they're prepared, but also at the peak of their exposure to risk because the stakes are high, the competition is fierce, and it's actually in this combination that we get flourishing as human beings. I wish I had time to go into kind of the theological side of this in more depth, but since we do have Baki students studying biblical and entrepreneurial thinking, I could just talk about this just purely as a human experience. But from a biblical point of view, I think we see both of these, interestingly, in the garden, in the two biblical accounts of the creation of human beings, male and female. They're given authority. It explicitly says that in Genesis 1. God blessed them and gave them dominion over all the creatures of the air and the land and the sea. So they have this capacity to meaningfully act. Adam is invited to name the animals. God could have told him the names, but God just lets Adam engage in the act of naming, which is an incredibly powerful, especially in the biblical frame, incredibly powerful, meaningful action. But there is also vulnerability in the garden, probably of many kinds, but maybe the most notable or interesting in a way is that the man and the woman are described in the second account as naked, though without shame. And it strikes me that we actually never use this word naked for basically any other creature. It's really only human beings who come into the world and in our natural state are in the world without, it feels like we're incomplete in some way. And we're certainly quite exposed to the elements, exposed to one another. Were we to be seen naked. And there are the man and the woman, the image bearers of God. And yet they're described with this word that inescapably has a connotation of a kind of exposure to meaningful risk, though without shame at that time. And it makes me wonder, actually, we often conceive of the image of God in human beings as a matter of authority. Could it be that the image of God also involves a kind of vulnerability, a kind of exposure to risk, that somehow that is essential to image God? Because certainly it is the case that the man and the woman in the garden have both. And certainly it is the case that when we are really flourishing, I think we almost always experience both. Now, this allows me to take a page from, consulting and business schools and give you a little 2x2 here. And we're going to use this to explore this seeming paradox that these two things actually need to go together, even though they seem somewhat different. And my case so far is that flourishing belongs up and to the right, that really where we were meant to be, where we were created to be as human beings, is authority and vulnerability, high authority, high capacity for action, and high vulnerability, high exposure to meaningful risk. Now, there are three other corners, so let's consider how we would want to think about each of those. And let's go to the lower left corner first. This would be low authority and low vulnerability, down and to the left. What is a good name for that corner? Well, one word that I've found helpful for it is safety. Safety being a condition in which you do not really have to act. You're not being asked to exercise authority. And you're actually not exposed, or at least you don't feel exposed to meaningful risk. You feel like everything that matters to you is safe and accounted for. And I actually think this is where every healthy human life begins. Every human life, if it could begin, let's say, in the way that our lives were meant to begin, they would begin here. And every parent, all parents, to the extent that they can, try to create an environment of safety for their infants, their very small children. But the interesting thing is we don't actually want our children, and we ourselves don't want to just stay in this lower left corner of low authority, low vulnerability. And in many ways, the growth of human beings, just thinking about the actual growth of an individual human being from childhood to adulthood, is this kind of unfolding story of increasing authority and increasing vulnerability. I do have a daughter who's 22 years old now, and when she was very young, we did all kinds of things to limit her authority. We didn't let her go out of the house by herself when she was 1 or 2 years old. We protected her from all kinds of things in the house, the knives and the electrical outlets and so forth. But as time went on, we gave her more scope for action. So we sent her off to, here in the US, kindergarten at age 5. And she walked to kindergarten with her older brother, who was 3 years older, but they walked up a little hill from our house, turned a corner, went out of my sight. And we were just granting her a little more capacity to act. But of course, also for me as a father, watching that little 5-year-old make that turn out of my sight, I was aware of all the risks that I could imagine she was exposed to, some imaginary, but some real. And it just kept going. She went off to middle school, and in our town, that meant she rode a school bus. She went to high school. She got her driver's license. Our daughter went on to university. And at every stage, she's acquiring capacity for meaningful action, but she's also exposed to more and more meaningful risk. And as a parent, this is what I want for my child. It's actually where I want her to go, up and to the right. And I actually think this is where all creative power directs the human story, you could say. And by creative power, I mean the kind of power that's exercised by leaders at their best. And probably all of us who are part of this seminar at some point have had responsibility for other people. And on the best days of leadership, the sort of healthiest, happiest days, the most fruitful days in some ways, you are helping people increase their authority and increase their vulnerability. I actually think great leaders give people more and more capacity to act, whether that's through training and teaching, kind of like we're doing now, or through kind of counseling and prayer, or through kind of giving people new opportunities, increasing their authority. But we also, if we're great leaders, also give people the chance to take on meaningful risk, because it's the path toward flourishing, not just for individuals, but for the churches we lead, for the organizations we're leading, the businesses we're trying to build. We move people up into the right when we're using creative power. And I really think this story, Safety to Flourishing, is what the human story was meant to be. The first human beings start out in a condition of relative safety. They're in a garden. They're not in the wilderness. The world is wild in a way, in its original creation, because God is wild in a sense. But God prepares for them a garden, which is a kind of safe environment with initially limited authority, capacity to act, and apparently restrained or constrained vulnerability. But God says, be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth, subdue it. As they go out, they're going to encounter the wildness of the world. They're going to encounter all kinds of challenges, all kinds of new environments over which they will have dominion, but in which they will also find new kinds of risk. And I think this was meant for human beings. This is how the story should have been. There are two more corners, though, and I want to address them because I think they fill in the other side of the human story. So let's go to the lower right, which is vulnerability without authority. And I'm going to initially for this use the word suffering. Because what is it to have incredible exposure to meaningful risk, but no capacity to act? That is, you know very well that things that matter incredibly much to you are on the line and could be lost, but you cannot affect what happens. You are at the mercy of others. You're at the mercy of events, perhaps at the mercy of the wild world. And you find yourself vulnerable without authority. And I think this is at the heart of what the suffering that is part of every human story. This is actually the only corner of all the corners we're going to look at here, that I can go into any room, anywhere in the world, and know that everyone in the room has been there. It doesn't matter if you live in the most affluent parts of the world or the most difficult parts of the world. Everyone has been in this lower corner, at least after those safe early years that some of us might have experienced in childhood. Not all of us experienced it even then, but all of us who have gotten to this night and this day have been to the lower right. And when you're there, you start to think about the upper left. Authority without vulnerability. That is capacity to act, but no risk, which sounds awesome. And what would the name be for that corner? I wrote a book called Strong and Weak that Deb mentioned, and I did not have the right name in the book. I call it something else in the book. But I realized a few years ago what the name is. The name for this upper right corner is control. Control is a situation where you can act with perhaps a great deal of capacity to have it matter and make a difference, but you have no risk. You actually know how it's going to turn out. You get what you want every time. And that sounds very appealing, I think, to many of us, maybe all of us. But the bad news of the universe is you can't actually have it in the systems that matter most. Control only really is a property of mechanical systems, machines. Machines do give us so much predictability because they are based on a very deep understanding of the natural laws of our world, that they can operate in controlled fashion. And when you put the right input in, you get the output you expect. And I was on a plane earlier this week, and that airplane, very complicated machine, went up into the air, came down with amazingly low risk, we know, because of commercial aviation in our world. So mechanical systems, you can have control. But human beings are not machines, and human groups are definitely not machines. Your family is not a machine. Your spouse is not a machine. Your congregation is not a machine. And this upper left corner, outside of the world of machines, I think is actually a mirage. It's an illusion. It is not actually somewhere you can stay, but it is certainly a corner you can pursue. And in fact, I think the pursuit of this corner is the great affliction of the human story. We might think the great affliction of the human story is down and to the right, the suffering that we've all experienced. But I actually think the biblical view is the pursuit of authority without vulnerability is our deepest affliction, because it is actually rooted in this thing that the Bible calls idolatry. Idolatry, the making of idols, I think always is about the pursuit of the upper left corner, because all of idols promise two things. They promise you shall be like God, and they promise you shall not surely die. These are the two promises that the man and the woman encounter in the garden. When the serpent entices them to eat the fruit and says, if you eat this fruit, you should be like God. That is, you will have all the authority you can imagine. But when the woman protests, well, we've been told if we eat the fruit, we'll die, the serpent says, oh, no, you shall not surely die. In other words, you are not as exposed to risk as you think you are. And what the idol there is promising, the original idol of that fruit of the tree, is authority without vulnerability. And I think most deeply control. Now, we think of idols often in terms of the history of what we call the world religions, and especially perhaps what we think of as pagan religions. We think of places in the world today where people still have idols that represent gods that they worship and propitiate. But I think we need to recognize that our world is full of things that I think the biblical writers would have recognized as idols, material things that we invest with the hope that they will give us control. So I think about addictive substances like alcohol, which can come in very, very appealing packages. But really often, if we use them in an addictive way, what are you drinking that cocktail for? Often to increase your sense of authority and decrease your sense of vulnerability. This idol, often when Americans first encounter it, comes in this form, not the previous form, in this red cup that's handed out at university parties, illegitimate underage drinking parties. And why are all those undergraduates drinking from that red cup? Because with every sip of that red cup, your authority, your sense of authority, your sense that you can act increases, and your sense of vulnerability decreases. All idols make these two promises, and all idols fail over time to deliver. All idols actually work at first. I think actually it's the case that idols, which we think of as false gods that can't act, that's the biblical idea in Isaiah and the Psalms, but actually they work at first. That's how we get hooked on them. Because the first time you take that drink, if you have a propensity to be addicted to alcohol, you will actually feel greater capacity to act. You will feel reduced risk. The problem is it won't keep working. The effect wears off. It works less and less well, and it demands more and more. In fact, I heard Jeffrey Satinover say once, all idols demand more and more and deliver less and less until eventually they demand everything and deliver nothing. The very thing that we as individuals, but also that human societies worship and arrange their lives around and sacrifice for and to in order to give us control, actually end up leading us to that very place we didn't want to go. And in the biblical mind, this describes not just what we might think of as the religious phenomenon of idolatry, but also what the biblical writers call injustice. Idolatry and injustice are the twin concerns of the prophets. Why? Because both of them make the same promise. Idolatry through what we in modern times would call a kind of religious impulse, but injustice through what we would call a political impulse, to create human systems where some people can live with authority without vulnerability, or at least it sure seems like they can, but it's always at the expense of others having to live with authority without vulnerability. if that makes sense. In other words, for some people to live up and to the left, they actually have to construct a system in which other people have to live down and to the right, where other people are stripped of the proper authority they're meant to have, experience more vulnerability than they were meant to have. Because I think there's a kind of law of conservation of vulnerability in the cosmos. You can't get rid of it, but you can displace it onto people who were not meant to bear it. When I think about the economic history of my own nation in its founding years, I think of three crops going from north to south: tobacco, cotton, and sugarcane in the American South and also in the Caribbean. And each of these were cash crops. They were not nutritious on their own. You could not build a society around these crops in the way that you can around food crops. But they were incredibly good at generating economic profit. And a group of people realized that if they could embed these crops in a system of global trade, they could make huge amounts of money for that time. And then they decided to outsource, to export, you could say, or impose all the vulnerability involved in raising tobacco in Virginia and cotton in Georgia and Alabama and Mississippi and sugarcane in the Caribbean. All that vulnerability they exported onto and forced onto a population that they enslaved. And of course, being enslaved is the ultimate down and to the right. You have been taken, all your authority has been taken away legally and factually. And you are exposed to all kinds of vulnerabilities you are not meant to bear. And idolatry and injustice always operate this way. And you might well ask, why do people put up with that? Why do they allow themselves to be put into this position? And the answer is only because of violence, ultimately. These systems are always sustained by violation of human dignity and by violence against the human person, because that's the only reason people would accept having their authority taken away and having their vulnerability increased beyond what they deserve. And I actually think that when you are on the receiving end of a system of violence that sustains idolatry and injustice, and by the way, they always go together, you actually have the condition that we recognize and sort of see as poverty. I don't think poverty is primarily about a lack of money in the first instance. I think it's about being on the receiving end of a system of violation and violence, often for generations, that tells you, your community, and people like you in your community, you do not have authority, you are exposed to vulnerability. And that's actually, I think, what we recognize as poverty. And if you remember, it may seem like a long time ago now, the other axis, the creative power axis, from safety to flourishing, and how that's how it's meant to be. I think this axis describes our world to a great extent the way it is, except that I would add that some people have the option of actually retreating from this whole system and going down into the left. And then I don't think I want to call it safety. I want to call it withdrawal, withdrawing from our proper responsibility for the world, our proper responsibility for justice in the world, and just trying to get to a place that feels safe, where we don't have to worry about the violation and violence, the idolatry, injustice, and poverty that are happening in other places in our world. And some of us on this call today don't live in places where anybody really gets to do that. But I live in a place, the United States, where people can do this and can withdraw. And in fact, I would say this is the dominant condition of American Christians and Americans to some extent, withdrawing from authority, withdrawing from vulnerability, so as to not have to confront the idolatry, injustice, violence, and poverty of our world. I'm afraid that to a great extent, this is our world. So I have come actually to the end of the time I was given. Deb, I hope it's okay if I take like 3 more minutes and
yes,
and
please, Andy. You should absolutely take as much time. We're going to be able to invite folks to give us some Q&A. So this would be a terrific time. If Andy has inspired, if the Holy Spirit is speaking to you, please jot down your questions and please take several more minutes. It's great. Thank you.
Okay. I appreciate it. Partly because there's actually good news, right? This is a bad news moment in this presentation, but there's good news about how this can be remedied. And this, I think, gets to our calling as what I would call redemptive leaders. So, and I can do it pretty quickly. What we need, if you think about this previous graph, right, and this system that we're in, and actually, I think most of us, if we're absolutely honest, we spend most of our days proximate to one of these 3 corners, not so much to the flourishing corner. What do we need? We need 3 redemptive moves. We now need 3 kind of interventions, you could say. And we're going to need to take the people in the upper left and move them over, right? So they are back to experiencing the vulnerability that is just part of being a flourishing human being. We're going to need to take people in the lower right, the ones experiencing suffering and poverty, and give them a way to regain authority. And then we're actually going to have to somehow call those people who have withdrawn back into real life. Now, the amazing thing, and I cannot remember which friend pointed out to me, it was not original with me, is that this actually maps onto the three offices of leadership in ancient Israel, in biblical Israel. Because those three offices, as many of us will know, were prophet, priest, and king. And I actually think that they map perfectly onto the redemption that's needed in a world of idolatry, injustice, violence, and poverty and withdrawal. Because the prophet's role is, in fact, to confront the perpetrators of idolatry and injustice. This is why the prophets speak so much about idolatry and injustice, because they are there to confront the perpetrators of this system and call them to repent and call them to proper vulnerability. The priest is there to help you when you do not have the capacity to act on your own. And who of us has the authority on our own to come before God? But the priest is there to help you make your sacrifice, help you approach God with a clear conscience and open hands and believe that God hears your prayers. The priest meets you in your lack of authority and elevates you to authority. And then I think the role of the king is to live a flourishing life before the people in a way, so that they don't retreat into withdrawal, but they actually live the life they were meant to live. So if you wonder, what's my job as a leader? I actually think it's three jobs. And it depends on the day, and it depends on who you're with, and it depends on the context you're in. And you need to discern the context, because the worst thing that can happen is to need a priest and have a prophet show up. Like, you do not need a prophet at a moment when you really need a priest. That person who comes alongside with compassion and care and believes that you can act and wants to see you act. But it's also really bad for human systems to have priests show up when prophets are needed. And none of these systems work unless we have people who live these kind of royal lives. Of course, kings and queens, and of course not in the sense of our human kings and queens, but the King of Kings, the Lord of Lords, who image Jesus in his flourishing life in front of others so that they can see and imagine that it would be better to come out of that lower left corner. So this is all good, but let me just add one more thing, and then I will be done, though it's an important final thing to say. I think there's one other thing that's needed. How will the power of idols and injustice be really, truly broken? Because these are very powerful things. I went through it, in one sense, too quickly, maybe, for us to dwell on this, but surely we all grasp the power of these forces in our world that promise us control, that enslave others literally and metaphorically to get that control. How can that power be broken? Well, if someone were a person of incredible authority and vulnerability, that is a person of true flourishing. And if that person were to voluntarily lay down their authority, that is, empty themselves of the capacity to act, and go to the place of suffering that most of us would never willingly go. And if somehow that sacrifice were not in vain, were not just tragic and empty in the end, then maybe we do not have to live in the upper left. And this is our story. This is our Lord, right? He who was in the very form of God did not count the authority that was his, equality with God, as something to be grasped, but emptied himself, went down to the lower right, took on the form of a servant, that Greek word probably just as easily translated a slave, and humbled himself, even to the point of death. And where are you more vulnerable without authority than at the point of death? Death on a cross, the most shameful form, the most exposed form, the least authoritative way to die, you might say. And therefore, God has highly exalted him and given him the name that is above every name. He did not remain in the tomb. He is, in fact, the King of Kings and Lord of Lords. He holds all of creation together, which this Wales window from Birmingham, Alabama, so powerfully depicts, that the crucified Lord is the risen Lord. And this way of sacrifice is the the fifth way. So some days you get to do creative power. Those are great days. Most days you do, what you might call redemptive power. That's prophet, priest, and king. But our calling is not complete until we're willing to go the path of sacrifice, because on the other side of that is rescue, resurrection, restoration. And I actually think the redemptive life is lived in this amazing cycle of emptying ourselves and then being refilled by the power and grace of God. And it's all on the right side of the graph. We don't, after childhood, we don't need safety. We don't actually need control. We don't want withdrawal. We live lives of risk, some days with a lot of authority, some days, as Paul says, carrying around in our bodies the death of Christ. But by the grace of God, living lives that actually break the power of idols and injustice. First in our own hearts, then in our neighbors and our friends. But we pray in the whole world that we're called to in mission. So, Deb, that was a little more than I promised, but I am now done with my part, and I would so love to hear what questions have come up for people.
Well, first of all, given that we're in a webinar format, I'm going to be at the clapping round of applause for giving us a framework that is both tangible and inspiring. And so as we consider several of the questions, the first one is, Andy, in your opinion, what are the negative power dynamics that you see leaders today have to learn to overcome? And I'm inviting Tommy Lee back into our conversation for the Q&A. So again, what are the negative power dynamics that you're seeing that leaders especially have to learn to overcome today?
Well, let's see. I would say coercion and manipulation are maybe the fundamentals. Coercion is the dream that I could make people do things that matter. And the problem is you can't actually make people do the most important things or the most redemptive things or the most sacrificial things. And those are the things that matter. Creative, redemptive, sacrificial are the things that matter. Now, you can coerce people to do various things, but mostly very, very minimal action and under duress. And yet leaders often resort to coercion, whether it's a tone of voice that belittles people and condescends to people, or that actually threatens people, right? And I mean, it's happening on a massive scale in our world right now. Vladimir Putin is doing this, but to be totally honest, his counterpart Zelensky also sometimes resorts to it in different ways, although Zelensky, who I certainly see as a hero in certain ways, as a television personality, he's probably better at the second distortion, which is manipulation, which is veiled coercion. It's actually making use of vulnerability to gain power. Manipulation does that, and so I mean, this is an extreme example, but Hugo Chavez, who was the president of Venezuela, the dictator of Venezuela for many years, would go on television and have these rants for hours. And of course, he used coercive power, but what his rants on TV were about were how threatened his nation was by outside enemies. And he didn't do this to actually address the real vulnerabilities of his nation. He did it to increase his own power and those around him. So coercion and manipulation are the things leaders resort to when they are seeking control. And when you see that happening, I guess I should actually say, when you sense it's happening in your own heart, go to Jesus, who never acted coercively and never acted manipulatively.
Yeah. It's such an important observation, as I think about the collective disruption that we've all experienced here in the last couple of years, where even the basic, physiological and safety needs of shelter and job security, I'm imagining that the activation of that coercion and manipulation has maybe been exasperated. And, Tommy, before we build in some additional questions, I'm curious to see, when you look at leaders who may otherwise be more prone to flourishing or have that sense of clear sightline, and then something gets taken or disrupted or a job loss, I often find myself like, it's easy to praise God and love Jesus. And all of a sudden you feel slayed, by a circumstance. And so can you speak to that in terms of the, sort of that redemptive loop? I mean, I guess when you've been slayed, you're at the ultimate state of vulnerability, and it's not that the Lord wants you to stay when it is the suffering, but can you speak to that at all, where, we might be on a good track as a leader, but then a circumstance seems so upending and disruptive?
Wow. Yes. I wasn't sure if you were addressing that to Tommy. You included Tommy, but are you asking me or
No,
Tommy?
I'm asking you. No, I'm asking you. And then
Okay.
Tommy's going to ask you a question. I know.
Right, got it.
I jumped on him. I said,
The
nope,
problem
not a
is
question for
Zoom.
you yet.
There's no
I got a second question.
eye contact on Zoom. It's so funny. Yeah. Well, right. So I think actually there's disruptive moments where we kind of learn what we're made of in ways that are very humbling. I think for me, one of the most vivid examples is not a kind of an organizational leadership, but I was a parent of two small children for a while. And when would I get angry at them? It was when my sense of control was slipping, honestly, when I felt like, oh, I'm not in control of these little human beings, which I wasn't. And in my best moments, I don't want to be. But boy, that desire to know where we're going and that I can get us there and that I'm the one in charge. I think it is the moment when we find out really what's inside of us. And we find that exploitation is inside of us. So what do? You repent. You repent to other people. You repent to God, and pick yourself up, and often get knocked around by life and suffer. And in that suffering, you cry out to God, and you are in that place of the walking in the Psalm 88. I'm really alone here, but it's not the end. God shows up in surprising ways on the other side of those things. And I think there's very few leaders who can be trusted with power who have not experienced dereliction, a sense that I've been abandoned, I've lost my way, I've lost my power. That's actually part of the tempering that we need to become the kind of people who can be entrusted with the real stuff.
No doubt. Great insight. And Tommy, we've got a couple of other questions in the Q&A. You want to grab one of them?
Or Deb, let me ask you a follow-up question. Andy, literally, I just sat down with the person, a member of a church who sat there and says, the problem I struggle with church is automatically, if you're going to be a member of a church, you have to then sit there and agree that you submit to the authority of the pastor. I totally understand it. Submit to, but then at the same time, when I disagree with a pastor or church leadership, they start reminding me that I need to learn how to submit to the authority, but they're not listening to what I have to say. How do you balance that? Because you are the lead shepherd. You are supposed to lead, but then you're also asked to listen. And sometimes you really strongly believe that this is what God is calling you to do, or sometimes you believe it so much that because this is something you want to do, you've confused yourself that this is God's will when it's really your will. How do you balance that, Andy?
Man, that's such a good question. Because I do think we are entrusted with legitimate authority, and sometimes we have to, I don't know if insist is quite the right word, but hold to what we know is good. And not everyone who is among our followers will see what's good, especially initially. But two thoughts. One is, I feel like most of us, most days, need to wake up and ask, what's the meaningful risk I can take today? I think most of us wake up thinking, what's the meaningful action? That is, we think about the y-axis. And I don't want to speak for everyone. We have people on this call in many, many different circumstances, including some very difficult ones, or at least places that make it very challenging. And you may very legitimately wake up, those of you in those places, and ask, how do I find the authority I need today? But that pastor who does have a flock, you could say, and does have people, at least in principle, willing to submit, and then especially those of us who are in more, frankly, powerful and affluent places, I just think the main question I need to ask every day is, what's my meaningful risk? Not even what's my meaningful action. So yes, you have a sense of calling and vision, but how is that going to be enacted? I actually think you've got all the authority you need in Christ. But are you following Jesus in the way of vulnerability? And I think it leads to the second thing, which is the more dramatic the vision you are calling people to, the deeper the sacrifice your own life has to model. You just have to go first. And Jesus did this, and great, not that this is our model in every way, but great military leaders do this. Great sergeants and lieutenants go first in the depth of sacrifice that they are then going to call the men and women that follow them into that. So you've got to double down on risk and double down on sacrifice if you're going to lead with that kind of vision. But what many people do is they double down on coercion and manipulation, to be honest. I do believe we're called to submit to our leaders. I also believe we're all priests and probably all prophets as well. The priesthood of all believers, in a sense, the prophethood of all believers, and certainly the royal reign as adopted sons and brothers and sisters of Jesus. So that submission is always in the context of submitting to one another out of reverence for Christ. And leaders who don't make room for that organizationally are deceiving themselves and those they lead. They're not leading in a Christ-like way.
Yeah. It's a build on question. We have another person who said that, being humble and vulnerable seems like character traits that seem most fitting for a Christian, and that authority can seem like a trait that's not fair, that it's like, it's out of bounds. So maybe you can say a bit more about that.
Oh man, exactly. And let me say, I actually meet a lot of people who I think are more afraid of authority than vulnerability in some ways. They're afraid of taking on the true capacity to act that is there for them, which is why we all need a priest who says, no, you can do this. And this, I agree. It's true that we think of humility, meekness, openness as Christian traits. But Mark says he taught as someone with authority, not as their scribes. And Christians should be able to speak and act meaningfully in the world. Now, by authority, I don't mean authoritarian or dominating or exploiting. I mean meaningfully acting. And we should be able to do that. And all of us should. And I do think, I'm grateful we have both of you moderating as a man and a woman. This is how we're created as human beings, male and female. God created us. The seminar would probably be better if I did it with one of my colleagues who is a woman, Mel or Jenna or some of the other people I work with. But, I think very broadly overgeneralizing, many men have to learn vulnerability, and they're taught really to seek authority, but not to seek vulnerability. But many women have to learn to seek authority and claim the authority that is yours as an image bearer of God. So we all have to pursue both, and it's a matter of discernment. Which do I need more in any given moment?
That's great. Tommy, I think you want to take the next question.
Andy, I want to pick your brain on something. I was in Atlanta with a mutual friend with their leader who fell from ministry and all that stuff. And one of the things that he says to me is, I look back and how do Jesus, in some sense, the leadership of Jesus created both Judas as well as Peter. How do I continue to lead where I'm not in the back of my mind sitting there saying, man, am I creating Judases and always scared of doing that? What would you say to him?
Well, I don't know that Jesus chose Judas and Peter, but I don't know that he made them who they were. I think he understood who they were. And he chose them anyway, because neither of them before the resurrection was an admirable person. And one forfeited the redemption that might even have been available to him in some sense, and the other received it. So the leaders, you're not going to prevent the people you lead from hurting you and hurting the mission and undermining the mission and betraying sometimes. I mean, I think one of the hardest things about being a pastor is betrayal. Well, it's hard for anybody, but I think pastors experience it more often than most leaders, frankly. Not necessarily in terms of a Judas level undermining, but just people who walk away after walking with you for 10 or 20 years. They just decide, well, there's a better church down the road. And that betrayal that pastors just have to absorb is unbelievable. And I would just say, in a way, real leadership starts on the other side of rupture. I'm borrowing that word from my friend Kurt Thompson, who speaks about this so eloquently, that all trust is built through rupture and repair. So I don't think Jesus didn't make Peter who he was, a sort of an overconfident and brittle kind of follower who denied him at the crucial moment. But what Jesus did that made Peter Peter is on the beach at the end of John, when he says, Simon, do you love me? Simon, do you love me? And 3 times, matching the 3 denials, he goes into that rupture and he repairs the rupture. And that does make Peter Peter. Now, there's a great mystery, about Judas as about Pharaoh. Like, was there any hope for these guys? I don't know. But we should always hold out hope that the people around us are not evil. They are sinful, and they're going to disappoint us. And that's when the work of formation starts, is when they disappoint us.
Absolutely. So I know as we're coming close to our end time, there are a couple of additional questions I'm hoping we can ask before we wrap for this section. No, you're doing great. No, it's I have like 10 questions actually that I wish to ask, but I'm going to start with, there's much to be said about the work, the ministry, the civil action that we saw in the life of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And we're preparing an event. Actually, the entrepreneur group is preparing an event that will reflect upon the life and leadership of Dr. King. And as you think about his leadership style, how do you think he did demonstrate strong and weak?
Wow. When we think about the most exemplary parts of the life of Dr. King, obviously we see this incredible ability for meaningful action, above all as a preacher, because that was his vocation. So as an orator, someone who had the power to use words in a compelling way, but also as an organizer, someone who could call people together and give a sense of what the right next action was. But it always came with the right next risk. And King, there's a book that's influenced me very deeply by Ronald Heifetz called Leadership Without Easy Answers. Many of us will probably know Heifetz's work. And he uses the civil rights movement as a linchpin case study in that book. And he points out that King was very, very careful in how he sequenced the risk. There was a reason he went to Selma, and it was actually to increase the risk to the right level, because there were other cities that actually would have changed their laws without violence. But he went to a place where he'd actually increase the risk, and the police, he knew Bull Connor would respond with violence, and that would actually play an important role. So he had a very strategic sense of what his next meaningful action was and what the next meaningful risk was to call people to. I would also say that Dr. King, in all kinds of ways that we don't have to enumerate, had gone to the lower right. He had sacrificially lived the lower right, and he had anticipated his own sacrifice, which is incredible. And I think we should also say, partly because in about 6 or 7 years, the secret tapes that the FBI made of Martin Luther King are going to be released to the public, but they have been heard by journalists already. And unfortunately, they're going to remind us that Martin Luther King Jr. also lived in the upper left, unfortunately, in his relations with women at certain points, and was extremely exploitative, I'm afraid, and complicit in exploitation. And that's something we haven't talked about a lot, because the movement he led was so important. But the truth is, he lived all three of those corners. But the one he never lived, I think to his credit, was withdrawal. So not a saint in my own view, to be totally honest, but an incredibly exemplary leader from whom we can learn a great deal.
Absolutely. So, Tommy, I know we've got a few questions and we won't be able to get to them now, but we'll certainly make sure that we give those to Andy and try and weave in some additional responses. Tommy, any final question for you? And then I've got one last one before we wrap this evening.
Yeah, last question for me. Andy, your father recently passed away, and thank you very much for joining us for this time. From a battle with ALS, as you think and reflect upon your dad, what influence did he have on you?
Wow, thank you for asking. My dad's name is Wayne, and he died on Saturday, just this past Saturday. And I was there at his bedside. ALS, many will know, is a disease where you gradually lose motor function, and eventually that isn't compatible with life. So, gosh, my own father, I think he taught me two things, and one was in his prime of life as a young dad. He taught me risk. My dad was a lover of the outdoors. My first real memory of him, specifically as my dad, was a camping trip that we took. And just him and me. I have a younger sister, and he took her on camping trips too, but this one was mine with my dad. And I just remember being kind of, led by my dad out into the wildness of the world and setting up a tent, and both that sense of protection, like my dad knows what he's doing, I was probably 6 or 7 years old, maybe for this. But also like adventure, authority. This was my father in his prime. And then he got sick and he was no longer able to do those things. For the last 6 months, he was largely in a bed. And I learned a lot from my father then as well. My father, who was not a religious man, I'm sad to say, did love people genuinely. Like he lived the second commandment. And to the end of his life, he lived with joy, and he found he found capacity for meaningful action, even as his bodily capacity wasted away. And his life was meaningful, very meaningful, until really the last moment. And if you don't mind me, like sharing, we learned he was dying. We were 2 hours away by car, and my sister called and said these are his last hours. So of course we were getting in the car, and we called because it was likely, and it was the case, he had to be sedated just because of the pain. And but I had a chance to talk to him by speakerphone before he was given more pain relief. And I said, Dad, we probably won't see us, but we're on our way. We're going to be at your side very soon. And you've been a wonderful father, and we're coming to see you. And he couldn't speak, but he could whisper. And I only heard one word. He said, excellent. And I have to say that's a great last word to hear from your father. And think about that as a meaningful action. You know, he couldn't do anything. He was on he was at the end of his life, but he blessed me with that word, excellent. And to the end of my days, I'll remember that was the last thing my father said.
I'm going to withhold the last question and finish on the fine word of excellent. Andy, thank you. And thank you for sharing what the model of strong and weak can look like at the intersection. And your book is life-changing. And I just want to encourage everyone, if you are not following Andy's research and not having an opportunity to really be inspired by the blend of the best of a 2x2. I love that you wrote that in your book. Nothing like a good old MBA 2x2. But there's also a great privilege in flourishing is to also be able to hold other people's suffering. So thank you so much. And I want to say on behalf of the VC and on behalf of the Growth Center, we are grateful to have had this opportunity to learn and teach, be taught by you and to be experiencing you. And as we are wrapping up this part of the program this evening, I do want to invite all of the current participants and students of the Ray Bakke Certificate Program. We're going to give you a 10-minute break. So that will be, actually, I'll give you an 11-minute just to make it a round number. So if you'll return to the original link at 50 minutes past the hour, you will rejoin our class for this evening in biblical entrepreneurship and reflecting on what it is we've learned. Andy, God bless you, your family, and just pray that God continues to just supercharge and just optimize all the work that you're doing in bringing faith and flourishing to a meaningful access. So thank you so much.
Wow. Thank you so much, friends. It's wonderful to be with you.
Great. All right, all. Bye now.